Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. We've had a lot of requests to dig into Nepali history, and particularly to understand the different groups that have shaped the country. Today, we're going to look at some fascinating historical accounts and analyses that'll help us unpack how Nepal became what it is today.
Yeah, we're diving deep into the heart of Nepal today.
Exactly. So for our listeners out there, you're interested in the story of Nepal, right? And we've got some really cool material to work with today, stuff that'll shed light on some big turning points, like the Khas people, how they moved around, the rise of those Shah kings, the Newars, and their unique way of doing things, and how the Hindu caste system got adopted by the Khas. And, particularly we'll focus on how that affected the Dalits. It's a super intricate story. We're here to help you navigate it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle for sure, but that's what makes it so interesting to explore.
Absolutely. And right off the bat, our sources point to this long and complex history, even before the periods we're zeroing in on.
Yeah, it's not a simple story.
There's this whole Kirit culture that was present in the hills in the Kathmandu Valley, and we can actually still see traces of it, even during that later Lichavi period. You see it in non-Sanskritic terms, the words they used in administration, place names, all of that.
Right. Like little echoes from the past.
Exactly. It tells us that what came later wasn't just plopped down on empty ground, it built upon what was already there, like layers in a cake.
I like that analogy. Layers in a cake, each one adding to the flavor.
So let's start unpacking this cake, shall we? Let's talk about the Khas people. Our sources describe them as originating from the Indo-European language family, speaking an Aryan dialect. And in their traditional way of life, they were mainly pastoralists, focused on animal breeding. Sounds a lot like other hill communities back then.
It does, yeah. That was a common way of life in those environments.
So how did they fit into the bigger social picture back then?
Well, there's this ancient text called the Manusmriti. It's a pretty important document for understanding social structures and, laws and stuff back then.
Kind of sets the rules of the game, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like, according to the Manusmriti, the Khas were viewed kind of similarly to those Tibeto-Burmese speaking groups, like the Gurung and Magar.
Oh, interesting. So not necessarily a stark difference.
Well, the distinction, it seems, was based on whether a group followed those Brahminical rules. And since the Khas didn't, they were kind of seen as having a lower status within that specific system, of course. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Later on, the Chhetris Khas, they started believing they were actually caste Hindus with Rajput ancestry.
A whole identity shift. Wow.
It is a big shift, isn't it? Like rewriting their own narrative.
And it wasn't just a matter of belief either, right? Some Khas ended up settling in the Kathmandu Valley.
Right. But the Western Hills, that's where things really started to heat up in terms of social change.
But a crucible of change, huh?
You could say that. Our source highlights that the Khas in the Western Hills, their ancestors, they bump into the stratified caste system around the 16th century. And that's kind of a big deal because around the same time, similar ideas were popping up among other groups further east.
So a wider trend, not just isolated to the Khas.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a ripple effect across the region.
And by that point, that old Khas empire had already broken apart into those 22 smaller kingdoms, the Basi Raja, right?
Yep, exactly. The Khas Empire, it wasn't as unified as it once was. And the source actually connects that break up to the arrival of the caste system and also this rise in fatalism.
Okay, hold on. Fatalism.
So fatalism is basically this belief that your life is predetermined, that you don't have much control over your own destiny. And our source suggests that these Bakunistic principles, they kind of solidified this worldview. It reinforced the power of those ruling elites because if everything is fated, why bother trying to change things?
That makes sense. But wouldn't that impact, everything? Work ethic, ambition, even just how people view time and planning?
Absolutely. The text argues that it had this huge impact on all of that. Less drive to achieve, a weaker work ethic, a different concept of time that makes it hard to plan for the future. It's like a whole different way of seeing the world and yourself within it.
It's almost like a cultural shift in a sense.
Yeah.
A whole new way of thinking and being.
Yeah, very much so.
So we've got all this going on with the Khas in the West, all these changes. And then what's happening over the Kathmandu Valley?
Well, by the 15th century, it's divided, right? You've got 3 separate kingdoms.
Yeah, and Nepal really just meant the Kathmandu kingdom back then.
Pretty much. But then comes the 18th century, and you've got this new player emerging from the West, the kingdom of Gorkha.
Gorkha, right?
One of those 24 little kingdoms, the Chabishi Raja. in the Gandaki region.
Okay, so this area had its own unique development. What was it like there?
Well, it was influenced by the Meghar after the Lichavi period. And then, under Prithvinarayan Shah in the 18th century, Gorkha really started to, flex its muscles. What's cool is that their army, the force behind unifying all these different states, it wasn't just one group. You had Khas, Bahun, Gurung, Magar soldiers, all playing a part.
A real mix, huh? Unity and diversity, I guess.
You could say that. And Gorkha itself, it was different too. Our source points out that the caste system wasn't as strict there and that fatalistic worldview wasn't as strong.
So they were doing things a bit differently compared to the West and even the Kathmandu Valley.
Exactly. The Gorkhas, they had these more egalitarian principles.
Yeah.
People had more freedom to do their own thing, more social mobility than elsewhere.
Interesting. Maybe that's part of what helped them succeed,
Yeah, it's possible. This more open system, it might have given them an edge. And then, of course, when they did unify everything, the Khas language, which was already kind of a common language across the region, it eventually became the official Nepali language.
Making sense of all this history, all these moving pieces. And it's clear that this idea of caste, it's a big part of it all.
Yeah, definitely a recurring theme. And a complex one.
So let's shift gears a bit and focus specifically on the newer caste system in the Kathmandu Valley. Our source mentions how newer society had this really intricate structure with all these different caste groups.
True, but here's the thing. The Newars didn't really follow that rigid hierarchy, that strict separation between castes that became so common in other places, particularly compared to how caste worked in India. The source emphasizes that they didn't have those super strong caste councils or panchayats like you see in India, where caste kind of dictated everything.
So a bit more flexible then.
Yeah, more room for fluidity. And you know what? Their social structures, they actually existed before the whole formal caste system came into play. They were more about professions, trades, that sort of thing.
Oh, so it wasn't just about your birth, but what you did.
That seems to be the case. The source even highlights the Japu community. They're super important, for those ceremonies and festivals in Patan and Kathmandu. They couldn't happen without them. So it's this picture of different groups depending on each other, working together, not just this rigid hierarchy.
It sounds like a much more, interdependent way of organizing society.
Yeah, you could say that. Interdependence rather than just pure hierarchy.
So we have this picture of the Newars. Now, how did that Varna or caste system that we usually think of, how did that get introduced into this region?
According to our source, it seems like it came during the Lishavi period. Influence from the Gupta dynasty over in India.
So external influence is playing a role.
Definitely. And initially, it was tied to Vaishnavism, which was more of an elite thing back then. So Brahmins became temple priests, kings started using Kshatriya titles, that kind of thing.
But it sounds like it didn't really impact most people right away.
Right. Most folks continued with their Shiva worship, and they weren't really part of the formal caste structure. Sure, you started to see Bahun and Chhetri labels popping up, but there wasn't this, total reorganization of society based on caste.
Interesting. So those old pre-caste ways of doing things, they kind of stuck around for a while.
Exactly. And the Brahmins who came into the region, they seemed more focused on building connections with other migrant communities, forming these client castes, as the source puts it. So not so much about creating a local priesthood,
So that's the backdrop, right?
Yeah.
And then we get to how the Khas in the Western Hills, they run into this Hindu caste system and end up adopting it.
Yeah.
Our source points to the 16th century for this. So how did that happen? What were the consequences?
Well, this is where we see things getting quite different for the Khas compared to the Newars. Upper-class Khas and Samagar, too, they were initiated as Chhetri by priests. And usually there were fees involved, land grants, stuff like that.
So it wasn't exactly a free conversion?
Not really. It seems like it was more about, those who could afford it, solidifying their place in this new hierarchy.
Getting a leg up in the system?
Yeah, pretty much. But those lower occupational groups, shoemakers, blacksmiths, all those folks, they weren't really buying into it. And they definitely resisted that whole untouchable label.
Interesting. They saw through it, maybe. Didn't see the benefit.
Maybe. And what's really cool is that even now in the Kathmandu Valley, a lot of those groups are still not considered untouchable.
Wow. So there was real pushback against fully importing the Indian caste model.
Definitely some resistance there.
Hmm.
But for those Khas who did embrace the caste system, our source suggests that it got really tied up with those Bahunistic principles and reinforced that fatalistic way of thinking we talked about.
Right, we talked about fatalism a bit earlier, but it's probably worth digging deeper. How did this worldview affect the cause, once it took root?
Well, as we said, the source argues that it had a pretty significant impact, and not in a good way. It's linked to that decreased motivation, that lower work ethic, that different understanding of time, and it really seems to have affected people's sense of dignity and, their belief in their own ability to make things happen. And there's this link to dependency, too, which contrasts with those earlier, more cooperative relationships that seemed to exist before the caste system came along.
It sounds almost like it undermines some of those traditional strengths, those values of collaboration and self-reliance.
Yeah, it's like it introduced a new set of values that weren't necessarily beneficial in the long run.
And of course, this adoption of the caste system, it had some pretty big social implications, especially for those who didn't fit neatly into those Vaisya or Shudra categories.
Exactly. The source points out that it led to the marginalization of those groups, those who didn't want to or couldn't be categorized. And this led to the creation of those untouchable groups, kind of mirroring what happened in India, but with its own unique Nepali twist. And there's another interesting point the source makes about education. Traditionally, it was associated with privilege, right? But it wasn't always seen as a way to learn practical skills. It was more about status. So sometimes people from those lower strata, even if they got an education, they expected it to automatically elevate them instead of focusing on developing useful skills.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just about knowledge, it was about the social capital that came with it.
It seems so.
So we've explored the caste system, how it was adopted and how it played out, but it really does make you wonder what those earlier social structures were like before the cause adopted this more rigid system.
Yeah, it's an intriguing question. And based on what we've discussed about the Newars and how their social structures were more about occupation and trade, the source seems to suggest that there was a more open social order in place earlier on. More fluidity, less emphasis on birth as the defining factor.
More about what you brought to the table, not who you were born to.
Right. And the cause, too. The source mentions their martial prowess, their simpler way of life, how it was shaped by the environment, all before that ossification that came with the caste system.
So they were adaptable, resilient, and then things shifted.
Exactly. There's a contrast between that earlier dynamism, their ability to adapt, and then the more rigid, stratified society that emerged later. It's almost like a loss of that earlier energy.
And then, of course, there's Gorkha.
Right, Gorkha again.
Our source seems to hint that Gorkha's success, in unifying Nepal, it might have been partly due to those more egalitarian principles they had, that greater scope for individual initiative.
Yeah, it seems like Gorkha's relatively weaker caste system and the lesser impact of fatalism, those were significant factors in their rise to power. They had a different kind of society, one that valued individual contribution, maybe adaptability, at least in those early days when they were expanding.
So to wrap up our deep dive today, we've taken a journey through this crucial period in Nepali history. We've seen how the Khas migrated, how the Shah dynasty rose, and we've untangled the complexities of the caste system, how it was different for the Newars, how the Khas adopted it, and how it ultimately marginalized the Dalits.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. And it's important to remember, as our source points out, that Nepal didn't just copy-paste the Indian caste system. There were unique aspects, pushback against those rigid hierarchies, and this constant interplay between different social structures and beliefs. That's what shaped Nepal into the country it is today.
And that brings us to our final thought for our listeners. Given all this history, how do you think the adoption of these social structures, as our sources have described them, how might they still be affecting Nepali society today? Think about the discussions happening right now about social mobility, about equality, even about cultural values. Do you think those long-term consequences are still shaping things today, maybe in subtle ways? And what could we learn by digging even deeper into those pre-caste social structures, to really understand how they worked? Food for thought.
Lots to ponder.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time,
Take care, everyone.
bye-bye.